I still remember the sound of paper tearing. Not just any paper, but my resignation letter, carefully worded after 3 sleepless nights, ripped into shreds right before my eyes. Reginald's smirk as the pieces fluttered to his desk will haunt me forever, not because it broke me, but because it was the moment I decided to stop playing nice. What he didn't know was that he had just declared war on the wrong woman. My name is Anita Mercer, and for 5 years, I had been the invisible backbone of the Evergreen Conservation Initiative. While Reginald Ashford, our executive director, basked in the spotlight at galas and press conferences, I was the one knee-deep in wetlands, collecting data, writing reports, and designing the conservation strategies that made ECI a household name in environmental circles. Every award he received, every grant he secured, every glowing article about his visionary leadership was built on my work, and every single time, he made sure I knew my place was in the shadows. It started subtly. A project proposal I'd spent weeks developing would be presented at board meetings with slight modifications, and Reginald's name as the lead author. When I raised concerns, he'd pat my shoulder condescendingly and say, "Anita, you're too talented to worry about credit. The work is what matters, right?" His assistant, Patricia Chen, would echo his sentiments with a saccharine smile, making sure to CC him on every email where she subtly undermined my contributions. I told myself it was normal office politics, that if I kept my head down and continued producing excellent work, recognition would eventually come. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I had just returned from a month-long field study in the Pacific Northwest, documenting the impact of climate change on salmon populations. The data was groundbreaking, the kind of work that could influence federal policy. I'd barely slept for weeks, living in a tent, wading through icy streams, and working with a team of researchers who respected my expertise. For the first time in years, I felt valued. That feeling lasted exactly 48 hours. I walked into the weekly staff meeting to find Reginald presenting my findings. Not just presenting them, but claiming them as his own discovery. He stood at the head of the conference table, his PowerPoint filled with my photographs, my data charts, my analysis. Patricia sat beside him, nodding enthusiastically as he spoke about the innovative methodology he had developed. The key breakthrough, Reginald announced to the room of junior staff members and interns, was recognizing the correlation between stream temperature fluctuations and spawning patterns. It took me 3 weeks in the field to gather this evidence. 3 weeks. He'd spent 3 days visiting the site for a photo opportunity while I did the actual work. I should have stood up. I should have called him out right there. Instead, I sat frozen, my hands clenched so tight under the table that my nails drew blood from my palms. The rage that flooded through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just anger at being erased from my own work, it was the sudden, crushing realization that this would never stop. That I could spend the next 20 years of my career being Reginald's ghost, watching him climb higher on a ladder I'd built. After the meeting, I drafted my resignation letter. I kept it professional, thanking ECI for the opportunities, citing a desire to pursue new directions in my career. I didn't mention Reginald. I didn't mention the theft of my work. I just wanted out. Looking back, my naivety was almost amusing. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Reginald. His office was everything, mine wasn't. Spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, decorated with awards and framed photographs of him shaking hands with senators and celebrities. I'd been in that office hundreds of times, usually to brief him on projects he'd later claim as his own. "Anita?" He greeted me without looking up from his computer. "Make it quick. I have a lunch meeting with the director of the National Park Service." A lunch meeting I had arranged, using contacts I'd developed, to discuss a proposal I'd written. I placed the envelope on his desk. "I'm resigning, Reginald. 2 weeks' notice." For a moment, he didn't react. Then he picked up the envelope, opened it with theatrical slowness, and read my letter. When he finished, he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. "You think you can leave?" He stood up, still chuckling. "Anita, do you have any idea how this works? You're not going anywhere." "I have the right to resign," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Rights?" He ripped the letter in half, then in half again. And again, until my carefully crafted words were confetti on his mahogany desk. "You think you have rights? Let me explain something to you. Everything you've done here, every project, every report, every brilliant little idea, that belongs to ECI. That belongs to me. You signed a contract. The contract doesn't say I can't leave. No, but it does say that any proprietary knowledge or methodology you developed as an employee remains with the organization." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "And I will make absolutely certain that every organization in this field knows that you violated your contract, that you're difficult to work with, that you're unstable. Who do you think they'll believe? You or me?" My hands were shaking. "You can't do that." "I can do whatever I want, Anita. You're nothing without me. You're a field researcher with a chip on her shoulder. I'm the face of environmental conservation in this country. So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to pick up these pieces, you're going to apologize for wasting my time, and you're going to get back to work. Because if you don't, I'll destroy you. I should have fought back then. I should have recorded the conversation, contacted a lawyer, done something. Instead, I walked out of his office in shock, left the building, and spent the rest of the day sitting in my car in the parking garage, crying and shaking with humiliation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words, his smirk, the sound of paper tearing, and somewhere around 3 a.m, something shifted inside me. The hurt and humiliation began crystallizing into something harder, colder. If Reginald wanted to play dirty, I could learn to play dirtier. The next morning, I showed up to work with a plan. If I couldn't leave, I would make my remaining time count. I would document everything. Every stolen idea, every fabricated report, every instance of misconduct. I would build a case so airtight that even Reginald's influence couldn't save him. But first, I needed to make sure I couldn't be fired easily. I went to HR, hoping to file a formal complaint about the resignation incident. Diane Foster, the head of HR, greeted me with a nervous smile that immediately set off alarm bells. "Anita," she said, closing her office door quickly. "I heard about yesterday. Then you understand why I need to file a complaint." Diane wrung her hands, not meeting my eyes. "I can't process any complaints against Reginald right now." "What do you mean you can't?" "He called me last night. He said if I accepted any paperwork from you, if I processed your resignation or any complaints, he'd have me fired." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He's on the board of directors, Anita. He has more power in this organization than I do. I have 3 kids and a mortgage. I can't lose this job." I stared at her, this woman who was supposed to protect employees, who was supposed to ensure fair treatment. She wouldn't even meet my eyes. "So, I'm on my own," I said flatly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I walked out of that office knowing that the system wouldn't save me. The rules wouldn't protect me. If I wanted justice, I'd have to create it myself. Over the next 6 weeks, I became someone I didn't recognize. By day, I was the compliant employee, attending meetings, taking notes, responding to Reginald's increasingly condescending emails with professional courtesy. But every moment I wasn't being watched, I was building my case. I started with the digital trail. ECI's internal server was a goldmine of evidence. Every email where Reginald claimed credit for work he didn't do. Every edited document where my name was replaced with his. Every budget report where funds were mysteriously redirected. I made copies of everything, storing them on encrypted drives and cloud accounts he couldn't access. But I needed more than digital evidence. I needed allies. Melanie Park from accounting was my first recruit. She'd been with ECI for 12 years and had watched Reginald's corruption grow unchecked. When I approached her carefully in the break room one afternoon, mentioning casually that some budget numbers didn't add up, she gave me a long, measuring look. "You're building something," she said quietly. "Aren't you?" "I'm documenting the truth." She glanced around to make sure we were alone. "I have records of fund transfers that don't match the official reports. Grant money that was supposed to go to field research but ended up in discretionary accounts. I've been keeping copies for years, waiting for someone to actually do something about it." "Why didn't you report it?" Her laugh was bitter. "To who? HR? The board? Half of them are Reginald's golf buddies. I tried once, 3 years ago. Got called into a meeting and told that if I valued my job, I'd focus on my own responsibilities. We met after work that week at a coffee shop 2 neighborhoods away. Melanie brought a flash drive containing 7 years of financial irregularities, embezzlement disguised as administrative costs. Grant money redirected to pay for Reginald's travel expenses and entertainment. It was worse than I'd imagined. My next ally was David Chen, a young marine biologist who joined ECI 2 years ago with stars in his eyes and genuine passion for ocean conservation. Reginald had systematically crushed that passion, stealing David's research on coral reef restoration and presenting it at an international conference without even mentioning David's name. I was there. David told me when I carefully broached the subject. I was sitting in the audience watching him present my work. He saw me, smiled, and kept going. Afterward, when I confronted him, he told me I should be grateful for the learning experience. David had recordings. He'd started secretly recording meetings after the conference, documenting every instance where Reginald took credit for his work or berated him for minor mistakes. Combined with Melanie's financial records and my own documentation of intellectual theft, we had enough evidence to expose Reginald's entire operation. But exposure wasn't enough. I wanted consequences. During those 6 weeks, Reginald's behavior escalated. It was as if he sensed something was coming and wanted to assert his dominance while he still could. In staff meetings, he'd make increasingly cruel comments disguised as jokes. "Anita, you seem very focused on note-taking lately," he'd say, smirking as the room fell silent. "Are you writing a memoir?" The Invisible Woman of Environmental Science? I'm sure all 3 people who buy it will find it fascinating. Patricia would laugh on cue, and the junior staff would shift uncomfortably, knowing that laughing with him meant job security, while defending me meant career suicide. After one particularly brutal meeting where he'd spent 15 minutes mocking my presentation style while presenting findings from my own research, I went back to my office and added his comments to my documentation. Every insult, every instance of public humiliation, every abuse of power, they were all ammunition now. You're building quite the file on me, aren't you, Anita? I looked up to find Reginald leaning against my doorframe, his expression unreadable. My blood ran cold. Had someone told him? Was my entire plan about to fall apart? I'm just doing my job, I said carefully. Of course you are. He walked into my office without invitation, closing the door behind him. You know, I've been thinking. Maybe I was too harsh last month. You're a valuable employee, and I'd hate to lose you over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. You were having a bad day. Stress from the field work. I get it. He sat on the edge of my desk, forcing me to look up at him. So here's what I'm proposing. Forget about leaving. I'll create a new position for you. Senior Environmental Strategist. Nice title, decent raise, your own office. You continue doing the excellent work you do, and we both benefit. It was the carrot after the stick. Classic manipulation. And if I'd been the person I was 6 weeks ago, I might have been tempted. Job security, recognition, a path forward. But I'd changed. I'd seen behind the curtain. I knew what he was, what this organization had become under his leadership. That's a generous offer, I said, keeping my voice neutral. So you'll stay? I need to think about it. His expression hardened slightly. Don't think too long, Anita. Opportunities like this don't come around often, and neither does my patience. After he left, I sat in my office, hands trembling with suppressed rage. He actually thought he could buy my silence with a title and a few $1,000s. He had no idea what was coming. That afternoon, I received the phone call that would change everything. Miss Mercer? This is Zachary Bennett from the Regional Environmental Oversight Committee. I'd never heard of Zachary Bennett, but I'd heard of his committee. They were the independent body responsible for auditing environmental organizations that received federal funding. They had the power to investigate, to impose sanctions, to shut down operations if necessary. How can I help you, Mr. Bennett? We've received some concerning information about practices at ECI. Anonymous tips, really, but they were detailed enough to warrant attention. We're planning a formal investigation, and we're looking for someone with intimate knowledge of the organization to serve as our Director of Compliance Oversight. My heart was pounding. What kind of information? Allegations of fund misappropriation, falsified research data, intellectual property theft. Serious enough that if proven, they could result in criminal charges and the organization losing its federal funding. He paused. Your name came up several times in our preliminary research as someone who might have insight into these issues. I'd sent anonymous packages to environmental watchdog groups, to journalists, to anyone who might listen. I'd planted seeds of doubt about ECI's operations. But I'd never expected this kind of response. When would the position start? I asked, my mind racing. We'd like someone in place within a month. The investigation will be comprehensive, probably take 6 to 8 months. We need someone who understands environmental science, has experience with organizational operations, and most importantly, has integrity. I'm interested. Excellent. Can you come in for an interview next week? I scheduled the interview for exactly 3 weeks and 2 days from that conversation. 3 weeks and 2 days would be my last day at ECI. Over those final weeks, I refined my documentation into a comprehensive dossier. Hundreds of pages of evidence, organized chronologically, cross-referenced, backed up in multiple locations. Financial records from Melanie showing systematic embezzlement. Audio recordings from David proving intellectual theft. My own detailed logs of every project Reginald had stolen, complete with original drafts, timestamp data, and email chains showing the evolution of ideas from my keyboard to his presentations. But the crown jewel was something I'd discovered by accident. Patricia, in her eagerness to please Reginald, had been sloppy with digital security. I'd found her logged into the shared computer in the conference room one day, her email still open. In her sent folder were messages to board members and donors containing fabricated research results. Environmental assessments that showed positive impacts where none existed. Data manipulated to justify continued funding for projects that weren't delivering results. She'd been doing Reginald's dirty work, and she'd left a trail that led directly back to both of them. The night before my last day, I barely slept. I kept reviewing the plan, looking for flaws, for anything that could go wrong. At 3 a.m, I finally accepted that I'd done everything I could. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. I arrived at the office at 6:30, 2 hours before anyone else. I needed time to prepare, to go through the evidence one last time, to steel myself for what was coming. At 8:15, I sent the email, It went to 47 recipients, every member of ECI's board of directors, every major donor, the heads of the 3 largest environmental foundations that funded our work, journalists at the New York Times, Washington Post, and National Geographic, representatives at the EPA and the Department of the Interior, and Zachary Bennett at the Regional Environmental Oversight Committee. The subject line was simple: evidence of systemic fraud at Evergreen Conservation Initiative. The body of the email was brief, professional, devastating. I outlined the key findings: embezzlement of approximately $3.7 million over 5 years, falsification of research data on 14 major projects, systematic intellectual property theft from at least 6 employees, and intimidation of staff members who attempted to report misconduct. I attached the full dossier as a PDF. 532 pages of evidence, organized into sections with a detailed table of contents, every claim backed by documentation, every allegation supported by hard proof. Then I clicked send and waited. The first response came 12 minutes later. A board member I'd never met, demanding an emergency meeting. Then another. Then 5 more in quick succession. My phone started ringing. I ignored it. My email inbox was filling up faster than I could read the messages. 15 minutes after I sent the email, I heard screaming from the executive floor. Reginald's voice, high-pitched and panicked, echoed through the office. Who the hell sent this? Who gave them access to these files? I calmly gathered my belongings. My personal items had been mostly removed over the past week, taken home a few pieces at a time so no one would notice. All that remained was my laptop, which I carefully wiped and left on the desk, and the few photographs I'd kept of fieldwork I was proud of. Patricia appeared in my doorway, her face flushed. The board wants to see you, now. I'm sure they do. The boardroom was chaos. 8 of the 12 board members were already there, some on their phones, others huddled in angry conversations. Reginald stood at the head of the table, his face an alarming shade of red, his tie loosened, sweat visible on his forehead. Eleanor Walsh, the board chair, was the only one who appeared calm. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, a retired federal judge who'd joined ECI's board 2 years ago. Her reputation for fairness was legendary, but so was her intolerance for corruption. "Miss Mercer," she said as I entered, "please sit." I remained standing. I'd prefer not to. "This email you sent," one of the other board members sputtered, waving his phone. "These are serious allegations. Do you have any idea the damage this could cause?" "I'm aware of the damage these actions have caused," I replied calmly. "That's why I documented them." Reginald slammed his hand on the table. "This is slander, lies from a disgruntled employee who couldn't handle not getting promoted." "Everything in that document is verifiable," I said, looking directly at him. "Bank records, email chains, audio recordings. If any of it is false, I invite you to sue me for defamation. I'll be happy to defend every single claim in court." "You vindictive little..." "That's enough, Reginald," Eleanor cut him off sharply. She turned to me. "Miss Mercer, you sent this to media outlets and government agencies before bringing it to the board. Why?" "Because 6 weeks ago I tried to resign. Reginald tore up my resignation letter and threatened to destroy my career if I left. When I went to HR to file a complaint, I was told that nothing could be done because he'd threatened to fire anyone who processed paperwork against him. The system within this organization is designed to protect him, not to uncover the truth." "So you stayed," Eleanor said slowly, "and spent 6 weeks gathering evidence." "I stayed to ensure that what I documented couldn't be dismissed or buried. I stayed because I believe in the mission of environmental conservation, and I couldn't let it be used as a cover for fraud and abuse." Patricia stepped forward. "She's lying. She has a grudge because..." "I have emails from you," I interrupted, "sent to board members and donors, containing falsified data. Would you like me to read them aloud, or would you prefer to stop talking?" She paled and stepped back. Eleanor stood. "This meeting is over. Reginald, Patricia, you're both suspended pending a full investigation. Miss Mercer, I want to speak with you privately." The room erupted in protests and arguments, but I was already moving toward the door. I had nothing more to say to these people. In Eleanor's private office, away from the chaos, she poured 2 glasses of water and handed me one. "That took courage," she said quietly. "It took 6 weeks of rage. Sometimes that's what courage looks like." She sat down heavily. "I've been on this board for 2 years. I've had concerns about Reginald's management style, but nothing concrete. Every time I asked questions, I was told I was being too harsh, that he was bringing in grants and raising our profile. I should have pushed harder." "You couldn't have known." "That's not an excuse." She looked at me intently. "What do you want out of this, Anita? Revenge? Compensation? Reinstatement?" "I want the truth on record. I want the people who were hurt by this to know it wasn't their fault, that the system was rigged against them, and I want to make sure this can't happen again." "You're not asking to come back as executive director?" "I have a new job. I start Monday." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "The Oversight Committee. They offered me the position of Director of Compliance Oversight. I'll be responsible for auditing organizations like ECI, ensuring that federal funds are used appropriately and that employees are protected from retaliation. Eleanor smiled grimly. So you're going to make sure no one else can do what Reginald did? Exactly. Then I wish you luck, and I'm sorry we failed you. I set down the water glass. Don't be sorry. Fix it. I left the office and headed for the elevator. I had one more thing to do. Reginald was waiting by the elevator bank. His earlier rage cooled into something more dangerous. Cold fury. You destroyed me, he said quietly as I approached. No, you destroyed yourself. I just documented it. I made you. Everything you accomplished here was because I gave you opportunities. The elevator arrived. I stepped inside and turned to face him. You took credit for my work, Reginald. You stole my ideas, manipulated my data, and tried to trap me in a system where I had no voice. You didn't make me. You tried to erase me. There's a difference. I'll make you pay for this. I still have friends, connections. You had connections, past tense. By tomorrow, every environmental organization in the country will know what you did. Your friends will distance themselves to protect their own reputations. You're done. His face twisted with impotent rage. You'll regret this. The only thing I regret, I said as the elevator doors began to close, is not doing it sooner. The next 6 months were a whirlwind. The investigation into ECI was comprehensive and brutal. Federal auditors found evidence of fraud extending beyond what I'd documented. Reginald was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion. Patricia cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing testimony that implicated several board members in covering up Reginald's misconduct. The organization lost 70% of its funding. 3 board members resigned in disgrace. The media coverage was relentless, turning ECI from a respected conservation leader into a cautionary tale about unchecked power and institutional failure. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my new role with the Oversight Committee. Zachary Bennett turned out to be exactly the kind of boss I'd needed all along, demanding but fair, protective of his team, and absolutely committed to rooting out corruption in environmental organizations. My first act as Director of Compliance Oversight was to implement a new reporting system. Any employee at a federally funded environmental organization could now file confidential reports of misconduct directly to our committee, bypassing internal HR and management. We established protections for whistleblowers and mandatory external audits for organizations receiving more than $5 million in federal grants. The changes rippled through the entire sector. Organizations that had operated with minimal oversight suddenly found themselves subject to rigorous review. Some resisted. Many complained about the additional bureaucracy. But slowly, things began to change. 4 months after I sent that email, I received a call from a young researcher at a small conservation group in Montana. She'd discovered that her supervisor was manipulating data to secure additional funding. She was terrified to report it, scared of losing her job, scared of retaliation. I found your name in an article, she said, about what you did at ECI. I thought maybe you'd understand. I walked her through the reporting process. I assured her that our committee would investigate confidentially. I promised her that she wouldn't be alone. 2 months later, her supervisor was removed. The organization cleaned house, and the young researcher was promoted to lead her own research team. She sent me a thank you note with a photo of her first independent project, a successful river restoration that would protect salmon habitat for decades. That photo sits on my desk now, a reminder of why I did what I did. 6 months to the day after I sent that email, Eleanor Walsh called me. The board would like to speak with you, she said. We've restructured the organization completely. New board members, new oversight procedures, new leadership team. We'd like to offer you the position of executive director. I was sitting in my office at the oversight committee, looking out at the city, exactly where I wanted to be. Thank you, Eleanor. But I'm exactly where I need to be. I thought you might say that. Then let me ask you something else. Would you be willing to serve on our advisory board? Help us rebuild ECI into what it should have been all along? I considered it. The old me, the one who'd been beaten down and silenced, would have said no, would have wanted nothing to do with the organization that had failed me. But I'd changed. I'd learned that real power wasn't about revenge. It was about transformation. I'll do it, I said. On one condition. We establish a fellowship program for young researchers. Full funding, full credit for their work, mentorship from experienced scientists. We make ECI a place where talent is nurtured, not exploited. Consider it done. 3 months ago, I ran into Reginald at a coffee shop. He was waiting for his lawyer, preparing for his trial. He looked 10 years older, his face drawn, his expensive suit hanging loosely on a frame that had lost weight from stress. He saw me and his eyes narrowed with hatred. I could have walked past him. Should have, probably, but I found myself stopping at his table. Anita, he said, my name sounding like poison in his mouth. Reginald, come to gloat? No, I came to get coffee. He laughed bitterly. You destroyed my life. I hope you're proud. I looked at this man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable. Now he was just another criminal awaiting trial, his influence gone, his reputation in ruins, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, not even anger. He was simply irrelevant. I didn't destroy your life, Reginald. You made choices. You stole from people who trusted you. You abused power. You hurt people who were just trying to do good work. Those were your choices, not mine. If I hadn't sent that email, you'd still be stealing. You'd still be hurting people. You'd still be corrupting an organization that's supposed to protect the environment. At least this way, it stops. His lawyer arrived before he could respond. As I walked away with my coffee, I heard him trying to explain to his attorney why he needed to sue me for defamation. I kept walking. He couldn't hurt me anymore. Last week, the first class of the ECI fellowship program was announced. 20 young researchers from diverse backgrounds, each receiving full funding for their projects, each given the credit and support they deserved. I attended the welcome ceremony and watched their faces light up as they talked about their work, their dreams, their passion for conservation. One of them, a young woman studying wetland restoration, approached me afterward. "You're Anita Mercer, right? The one who exposed the fraud at ECI?" "That's me. I almost didn't apply for this fellowship. I'd heard stories about how this organization used to operate, how researchers would get used and discarded. But then I read about what you did, how you stood up to them. It made me think that maybe things could be different, that maybe someone would actually care about my work. I thought about who I'd been a year ago. The woman who'd sat in her car crying, who'd felt powerless and small, who'd believed the lies that she was nothing without the people who were exploiting her. You are your work, I told her. Not the title, not the institution, not someone else's approval. The work itself. Never forget that. She smiled and went back to join the other fellows, and I stood there feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not just for myself, but for all of us who'd been silenced, who'd been told we didn't matter, who'd been made invisible. Today, I woke up at 6:30, made coffee, and went for a run before work. Simple things that I'd stopped doing during those years at ECI, when every morning felt like preparing for battle. I got ready for work in my apartment that I chose, in a city where I want to be, preparing for a day where my work would be credited to me, where my voice would be heard, where I had the power to protect others from what I'd endured. My phone buzzed with a message from David Chen. He'd just published his first paper under his own name, on coral reef restoration. The methodology he'd developed, the research Reginald had once stolen, was now recognized as groundbreaking. He was being invited to speak at conferences, to collaborate with major research institutions. His career was finally his own. Melanie Park had taken early retirement from ECI and was now working as a forensic accountant, helping investigate financial fraud in nonprofit organizations. She'd found her calling in, making sure what happened to us couldn't happen to others. We'd all moved forward. We'd all transformed our pain into purpose. As I sit in my office now, looking at the stack of compliance reports on my desk, each one representing an organization that's now subject to oversight, to accountability, to the kind of transparency that protects employees and ensures resources go where they're supposed to go, I think about that moment when Reginald tore up my resignation letter. He thought he was demonstrating his power. He thought he was putting me in my place. What he actually did was show me that working within the system wouldn't save me, that waiting for someone else to fix things was pointless, that if I wanted justice, I'd have to create it myself. The sound of paper tearing still echoes in my memory sometimes. But now, instead of humiliation, I hear opportunity. The moment when I stopped being silent. The moment when I decided that my story wouldn't end with defeat. I don't know what Reginald hears when he thinks about that day. Probably his own arrogance, the beginning of his downfall. Maybe he regrets it. Maybe he tells himself that I overreacted, that I destroyed him over nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was 5 years of stolen work. It was every young researcher who'd been exploited and discarded. It was every person who'd been told to stay quiet, to accept abuse, to be grateful for opportunities that should have been theirs by right. It was a broken system that protected predators and punished victims. And now, every time I approve a new oversight protocol, every time I take a call from a frightened employee who needs help, every time I see one of those young fellows present their research with pride and confidence, I know that the sound of that paper tearing wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something better, not just for me, but for everyone who comes after.